Welcome to Stories Pulse. In today's shocking and emotional tale, we dive deep into the story of Grace, a young girl abandoned by her parents after a life-altering secret is uncovered. Years later, she returns to confront her past, and what happens next will leave you speechless. If you love heart-wrenching stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more incredible content, hit the bell icon so you never miss an update, and like and share this video with your friends. We'd love to hear your thoughts, so drop a comment below and let us know what you think. Stay tuned for more gripping stories only here on Stories Pulse. Grace Parker grew up in a small, tight-knit community where everyone knew everyone's business. Her parents, William and Ellen Parker, were well-respected pillars of society. They lived a strict, conservative lifestyle, deeply involved in their church and community events. To the outside world, they were the perfect family, and they expected nothing less than perfection from their children, especially Grace. Grace was a bright, inquisitive girl with a smile that lit up rooms. She was curious about the world, often questioning the rigid boundaries her parents set for her. But beneath the surface of this perfect family lay cracks, unspoken pressures, rigid expectations, and an unyielding need to maintain appearances. One summer, everything changed. Grace, just 12 years old and still very much a child, became pregnant. It was a mistake born out of innocence and ignorance, something she barely understood herself. Terrified and confused, she hid her growing secret for months, fearing the wrath of her parents. When Ellen discovered her daughter's pregnancy, the betrayal cut deep. The Parkers, who had built their lives on strict moral principles, felt ashamed and outraged. Rather than support their daughter in her darkest hour, they made a decision that would haunt them for years. They kicked Grace out of their home. The shame, they reasoned, was too much for them to bear. They couldn't face the gossip, the judgment, and the ruined reputation. Grace, barely a teenager and carrying the weight of an impossible situation, was abandoned by the only people she had ever known to love her. Her world shattered as she found herself homeless, pregnant, and alone in a world that seemed to close its doors to her at every turn. Grace wandered from place to place, relying on the kindness of strangers and the occasional shelter. She was too young to know how to survive, but too stubborn to give up. The early months were a blur of hunger, fear, and loneliness. She had no contact with her parents or anyone from her former life, and each day seemed like a battle for survival. When Grace finally gave birth to her daughter Lily in a rundown shelter, something inside her shifted. Holding her tiny child in her arms, she made a vow to protect Lily no matter the cost. Though she was a child herself, Grace found a strength she never knew she had. She worked odd jobs, moved from town to town, and learned to navigate the harsh realities of her situation. Despite the challenges, Grace and Lily shared a bond that gave her the will to keep going. Years passed. Grace, now in her early 20s, had rebuilt her life to some degree. She had found a stable job as a waitress, and while life was still difficult, she had created a small, safe world for herself and Lily. But despite her efforts to bury the past, the scars of her childhood and her parents' betrayal never truly healed. As Lily grew older, she began asking questions about her family, questions Grace couldn't answer. She had never told her daughter about her parents or the town she had left behind. She had tried to erase that chapter of her life, but deep down she knew that one day she would have to face it. That day came sooner than she expected. A letter arrived in the mail one morning, addressed to her in handwriting she recognized instantly. It was from her mother, Ellen. The letter was brief and cold. Her father was gravely ill, and they wanted her to come home. No apology, no remorse, just a request, almost a demand, to return. Grace was torn. She had vowed never to return to the town that had rejected her, never to face the people who had cast her out. But something inside her, a mix of guilt, anger, and unresolved pain, compelled her to go back. She decided to return, not for her parents, but for herself, and for Lily, who deserved to know the truth about her family. Grace's return to her hometown was met with shock and whispers. She had changed so much from the scared pregnant girl who had disappeared years ago. She was now a woman, strong, determined, and with a quiet intensity that intimidated those who remembered her as a child. With Lily by her side, she walked through the streets that once felt so familiar, but now seemed foreign and distant. When Grace arrived at her parents' home, the reunion was tense and uncomfortable. William, her father, was bedridden, his once strong frame now frail and weak from illness. Ellen, still stern and composed, greeted her daughter with a mix of guilt and resentment. There was no tearful apology, no heartfelt embrace. Instead, Ellen seemed more concerned with keeping up appearances, as if Grace's return was just another problem to manage. Grace's anger simmered beneath the surface, but she kept it in check. She wasn't here for her parents' approval. She was here for closure. She wanted answers. Why had they abandoned her? Why had they chosen their reputation over their daughter? But Ellen was evasive, deflecting Grace's questions and refusing to acknowledge the depth of her betrayal. As the days passed, the tension between Grace and her mother grew. Old wounds were reopened, and Grace struggled to keep her composure. She had expected this visit to be difficult, but she hadn't anticipated the overwhelming flood of emotions that came with being back in the place where her life had fallen apart. Meanwhile, Lily was curious about her grandparents, especially her grandfather, who seemed kinder than her grandmother. William, despite his failing health, made an effort to bond with Lily, telling her stories from his past and asking about her life. It was clear that he regretted the choices he had made, but he was too weak to make amends properly. One evening, as Grace sat by her father's bedside, he whispered something that shook her to her core. He told her there was more to the story of why they had kicked her out all those years ago, something her mother had kept hidden. Before he could say more, he succumbed to a coughing fit and couldn't continue. Grace's mind raced. What had her father been trying to tell her? What was the secret her mother was hiding? Determined to uncover the truth, Grace began to dig deeper. She spoke to old neighbors, former friends, anyone who might know more about what had happened all those years ago. Slowly, pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. It turned out that her pregnancy had not been the only scandal her family had been trying to cover up. Ellen had been involved in an affair with a prominent man in town, and Grace's pregnancy had been the final straw in a marriage already on the brink of collapse. To protect herself and maintain her social standing, Ellen had pushed William to make the harsh decision to kick Grace out, knowing that the focus would shift away from her own indiscretions. The revelation hit Grace like a ton of bricks. Her mother's betrayal ran deeper than she had ever imagined. All those years of suffering, all the pain she had endured, had been a result of her mother's selfishness and fear of being exposed. Grace confronted Ellen with the truth, and for the first time, her mother broke down. The mask of control and composure shattered, and Ellen confessed everything: her affair, her shame, and her desperate need to protect her reputation. But for Grace, the confession wasn't enough. She couldn't forgive her mother for the years of pain and abandonment. She had come back for closure, and now she had it. There was nothing left for her in this town, this house that had once been her home. The final confrontation between Grace and Ellen was explosive. Grace, finally releasing years of pent-up anger, told her mother exactly how much she had suffered because of their decision. Ellen, broken and remorseful, tried to explain herself, but it was too late. The damage had been done, and there was no going back. As Grace prepared to leave, taking Lily with her, something unexpected happened. Lily, who had been quietly observing the tension between her mother and grandparents, stepped forward and spoke. She told Grace that while she understood why her mother was angry, she didn't want to leave things unresolved. Lily, wise beyond her years, suggested that they find a way to move forward, not for Ellen's sake, but for Grace's. Holding on to the anger, Lily said, would only hurt Grace in the long run. Grace, stunned by her daughter's maturity, realized that Lily was right. She didn't have to forgive her parents, but she could choose to let go of the bitterness that had been weighing her down for so long. In that moment, Grace made a decision to walk away from the past, not in anger, but in peace. Grace and Lily left the town the next day. There were no grand goodbyes, no promises of reconciliation. But as Grace drove away, she felt lighter than she had in years. She had faced her past, uncovered the truth, and made peace with the pain that had haunted her for so long. Life after that was not without its challenges, but Grace was no longer running from her past. She focused on building a future for herself and Lily, one that wasn't defined by the mistakes of others. And while she would never forget what her parents had done,